Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I would like to share with you some thoughts on how to develop a game plan in chess, how to target weaknesses of your opponent. And as a tool, I have chosen a game played by the British Grandmaster John Nunn. Well, let's get started with this game, where he had the white pieces and started out with the most common starting move of all, e2 to e4. His opponent responded by playing knight to f6, which is somewhat of a rare choice. It's much more common to respond with playing e5 or c5 on move 1. This opening, though, has been named after the late world champion Alexander Alekhine. He was a very colorful player and won the world championship several times, and even an opening is named after him. The game continued now that the pawn is attacked on e4 by that pawn advancing to e5, which is the best and most common response. Alternatively, when a piece is attacked, you would have the option to protect it as well. And the natural way to do that would be, in this case, to simply develop the knight to c3 and protecting that pawn. So if black now would capture still on e4, the white knight would capture black's knight and gaining a more valuable piece than the pawn. Therefore, that would clearly be a mistake for black in this position. So going back to the game, which proceeded with e5, now not only that white moved away the pawn from the attack of the opponent, it immediately counterattacked black's knight on f6. Now the black knight needs to move and needs to find a place where it will not be captured. Moving the knight, for example, to h5 or g4 would be really bad, as then the white queen would capture that knight. So therefore, those options are out of question. Moving the knight back to g8 wouldn't make sense, as it would be developing backwards. It's like white already made two moves, and it's yet again white's turn, while black kind of did nothing so far, right? So that just does not make sense. So therefore, we're left with two other options, and one is to move the knight to d5 and the other to move it to e4. The better one is to move to d5, as black did in this game, as if the knight would move to e4, it will easily be attacked over and over by white's developing pawns and pieces. In addition, white may even play d4 at this point, with the idea to then trap the knight by playing f3. And if you look, that knight from e4 has no safe square to go to. So therefore, black is much better off, and the only reasonable move is to go to d5. And now white could attack the knight a second time, which is a very common move actually in this position, playing c4, when the knight typically would go to b6. And of course, this has been played many times, and it's considered slightly better for white because white is gaining all these tempos in attacking the knight, but nevertheless, it's certainly a playable opening for black as well. The game we're looking at continued by white just playing d4. This game that we're looking at right now, as you will see, it's a very good common sense game. That's one of the most important things to learn for a new player, is to learn what common sense is in chess. And generally speaking, in the beginning of the game, it is to occupy the center, which, as we can see, white did excellently already, with the two pawns being on d4 and e5. Opening files and diagonals for the pieces so the bishops and later the queen and the rooks can get out and be active, and develop the knights, and then castle for the purpose of putting the king into a safe area away from the possibly opening files in the middle of the board. Black responded right now by playing d6, initiating an exchange of those middle pawns as well as to open the diagonal of the bishop on c8. Here in this position, white also has the option to play c2 to c4 to attack black's well-positioned knight in the center. However, white was not rushing that and focused rather on developing the kingside pieces. Played knight f3, a natural developing move which immediately controls two center squares. In fact, if black right now would trade those pawns on e5, the white knight could simply recapture and immediately occupy an excellent centralized position. Black continued by developing the bishop to g4 and immediately pinning white's knight. However, that's not a reason for panic. Just because that knight is not advised to move right now, because it would lose the queen then on d1, it's really nothing to worry about for white. The simplest and best way to react to such a situation is to play bishop to e2, so-called unpin the knight. Now again, the knight will be free to move. For example, if black would trade the pawns, white would have a pleasant choice of taking back with the knight or with the pawn. The game continued with black's responding e6, getting ready to develop the other bishop as well, and white castled. So as you can see, so far, white has been very diligently following the basic opening principles, occupying the center, developing your pieces, and castling, putting the king to safety. So far, things are going pretty well for white. Although we have to say, black also is developing in a normal, expected way. Now, white played h3, attacking the bishop on g4. I usually say do not move your pawns after you castle that are in front of your king. However, this is an exception from that general rule, just moving an h-pawn up by one square, and that is, whether it's attacking that bishop on g4 or not, an often played move for the purpose to open a little window for the white king to escape from any potential future back rank checkmates. In this case, since the bishop on g4 is being attacked as well at the same time, white is actually gaining time, or at least not wasting time, in that the black bishop now better moves, otherwise it will be captured. So this is a very common move to add when a bishop is on g4. Black's response was to move to h5, maintaining kind of that semi-pressure over the knight on f3. Of course, as long as white keeps the bishop on e2, there are no real issues there. And finally, the time arrived when white played c4, attacking black's excellently centralized knight on d5. Again, in a situation like this, an experienced eye would really consider only one move for black, and that is to move the knight to b6. If you look carefully, you'll notice that the knight does not have too many choices of squares where it wouldn't be captured. The only other square other than b6, which black chose in the game, would be to go to b4, but that wouldn't look very good because the white queen could immediately check and put black in an unpleasant situation. So let's go back and continue with the actual game, where black continued with knight b6. Now it's quite important to notice that black does not have an actual threat, although at first it may seem that they have. White could simply continue developing the knight to c3. Remember that whenever your opponent makes a move, be aware of what may be the potential threat or threats. In this case, we saw that the black knight went to b6 and is eyeing at white's pawn on c4. However, that very same pawn is actually protected by white's bishop on e2. So what we need to be aware of is that if black right now would capture the knight on f3, obviously it wouldn't be fun to capture back with the pawn, because that would open up the file in front of the white king. And that would certainly be clearly weakening. So therefore white should try to take back with the bishop. But now you may say that how about that pawn on c4 now? Well, it's true that black actually did capture the pawn, but this has two different problems. On one hand, that the white bishop is able to grab a pawn as well, and moreover, not just grab a pawn, but trap black's rook in the corner. This is one of the reasons why it's so important to hurry up and develop your pieces, and preferably not to move the same piece over and over, but develop each of your minor pieces before you would start moving the same piece a second time. In addition to that excellent move, bishop b7, another excellent one is to play queen a4 check. Again, black is suffering because of lack of development, because the black king has not castled yet, and the knight on c4 is on an unprotected square. So at this point, it doesn't matter how black will defend against this check, the knight on c4 will be lost. Okay, so now that we know that in the position after white playing knight c3 on move 9, black cannot capture and win a pawn on c4, let's see how the game continued. Black played kind of pretty well by castling. So far things are going in a pretty standard way, although we need to state that white has some space advantage. Generally, we define space advantage by one side controlling more squares on the board than the other. And the way typically we control more squares if our pawns are more advanced than our opponents. When you look at a chess position, you see a chess board with 8 ranks going up and down. Normally, we consider ranks 1 through 4 as white's territory, while 5 through 8 black's territory. So in this situation, white has a pawn all the way to the 5th rank in enemy territory, 2 pawns on the 4th rank, which is pretty good. However, black hasn't yet crossed with any of his pawns the 6th rank. So therefore, the movement of the black pieces are a lot more limited. And now at this stage, white finally completed the development of all the minor pieces by playing bishop to e3. As we can see, the white pieces are pretty actively positioned. The 2 knights and the bishop on e3 are all controlling important center squares, while the bishop on e2, on a temporary basis, is neutralizing the pin that the black bishop on h5 has created over the white knight on f3. So we can see that white has a more active position when the black pieces have a lot less options for movement. Black continued also to develop the last minor piece, which was still sleeping, back on b8 and played knight c6. Now this move creates kind of a threat because puts more pressure on white's pawn on e5. Not only that the black pawn on d6 is targeting the e5 pawn, so is the black knight on c6, and black has in mind to eliminate the white knight from f3, which is one of the key defenders of that pawn on e5. So this is a key moment when we need to think what to do. Should we automatically think on defense? Not necessarily. In fact, in general, we should see if we can rather play actively and move forward. In this case, the best option is the way white continued, by trading those pawns on d6. Now, black has to be immediately very careful, because if black would capture back with the queen or with the bishop, immediately black would find himself with a knight on b6 and queen on d6 being set up for a fork, which means that the two pieces that are attacked cannot run away all at once, and therefore one of those two pieces would be lost. Naturally, black knew better and therefore captured back with a pawn. As you can see in this game, it's very important to always try to foresee what the opponent is trying to do. And at this stage, it's an important moment because black has fully developed and is looking for ways to gain more territory and space, and black could do that by advancing either the e or the d pawn forward. However, it was white's turn first, and therefore white did it on his own, playing d5. Again, to gain space advantage and a little bit of time by attacking black's knight on c6. The black knight has to be very careful where to go. If it would go, for example, to b4, it's not a very great square, as it doesn't have any purpose on being there. First of all, white would have the opportunity to immediately trade and create so-called hanging pawns. Pawns that are on open files for the opponent, meaning they are potentially targets of the white rooks and other pieces. And the fact that at least one of those two pawns can never ever be protected by another pawn means that they are potential weaknesses. Of course, white may choose first to attack that knight on b4, making sure it cannot go back to c6, and only when it goes to a6, then to capture on e6. As we know, knights generally are misplaced at the edge of the board. It's better to have them centralized if we can make it happen. So going back to the game, black chose to exchange the pawns on d5. Now white could have captured back with the pawn or the knight, and it's very important to recognize that after white captures the pawn on d5, black will have an isolated pawn on d6. However, that only has importance if white does not have a pawn in front of it. If white now would capture back with a pawn, then they are both isolated pawns on the d file, and one is not particularly stronger or weaker than the other. So therefore, it was a smart idea for white to capture back with the knight, and keeping only the black pawn on d6 isolated and a target of the white rooks and other pieces in the near future. And therefore, if right now black would trade the knights on d5, which piece should you capture back with? Yes, it is the queen. We do not want to put one of our own pawns in front of the enemy's weakness. Black did not capture on d5, but instead did capture the knight on f3. And right now, white made an important intermediate move to further ruin black's pawn structure. If now the bishop would capture on f3, all of a sudden the pawn on c4 would be hanging. So therefore it was quite important to eliminate that knight on b6 that was targeting our c4 pawn. Black captured back on b6 and white captured on f3. Well, let's evaluate the situation, what's going on so far. Materially speaking, we have complete balance. However, if we view the pawn structure, we will clearly see that white has a much sounder chain of pawns, and in fact only 2 chains. Typically, it's best to have only 2 chains of pawns. The more chains of pawns you have, the worse it is typically. Right now, black has 1 chain in the F, G, and H pawns, and then has 3 isolated pawns that are typically targets of attack. Black continued with bishop f6, targeting white's pawn on b2. And yet again, white is choosing to follow a basic principle. Generally, it's a good idea to trade a knight for a bishop. Knight captured on f6, and the black queen captured back. So now black has still the 3 isolated pawns. In fact, 2 of them doubled on the b file. White has a bishop versus a knight left of all the minor pieces. So therefore, white's position is clearly better. Again, a situation when it's important not to forget what does our opponent want to do. And indeed, black intends to capture the pawn on b2. White simply played queen d2, protecting it. Chess isn't such a complicated game, as long as you use your common sense. Here, black has been playing a very interesting move, although not the greatest one. Generally, you'd want to occupy an open file if there is one. Black thought of an unorthodox way to play and tried to bring the rook maybe to the game through the 5th rank. It rarely works. White responded with a smart move by playing bishop d5, eliminating any thoughts of black's of that rook getting over to the king's side and aiding in the attack. Black responded, following up with doubling the rooks on the a file. Well, that's an interesting thought, but unless white just ignores the threat to the a2 pawn, it really doesn't go anywhere, and it's not where the black rooks should belong. White protected the pawn indirectly by playing rook f to e1. And here is a perfect example on something I was mentioning earlier in the game, namely the weakness of a back rank. Right now, black could not successfully capture the pawn on a2, because then, after the exchange of rooks, black would suffer after the back rank checkmate arrives with rook e8. So that's what I mean, that it's important to open a little window of escape in such situation. In this case, black played h6, opening that little window. Although, considering the fact that white has a light-squared bishop, which can potentially guard that h7 square, it would have been actually smarter to play g6 instead. So the game continued with h6, and now white played a4, another tricky move. So if now rook captures, rook captures, rook captures, rook check, king can only go to h7, and then a fork, winning the rook on a4. Very sneaky, isn't it? Okay, let's go back and see what happened after a4 when black did not capture that pawn, but played instead knight d4, centralizing the knight. White centralized the rook. Rook a to d1, attacking the knight a second time. The knight had to go back. and now white simply protected the pawn. As we can see, white hasn't made any magical or special move the whole game, yet achieved significant advantage. Came rook d8, and now it's time to double the rooks on the open file which white already owns. Came rook e4, queen g5, offering the exchange of queens. White would have some advantage in the endgame as well after trading queens, but it's even superior keeping the queens on the board as white's position is significantly more active than it is black's. Rook returned to a8, and came rook d to e1. So now the rooks are doubled, and therefore black is unable to oppose the white rook with rook e8. Black played h5, and white brought the second rook out as well to e3. The idea is to come over to g3. The black king started running to f8, but it doesn't really help the situation. The idea of the move is to try to exchange those rooks. And now white had several good ways. The best was to play rook to g3 right away, attacking the queen, although the game continued with rook f3, which was an inaccuracy. Although it attacks the pawn, black protected it. White played h4. And now queen went to h6, was a bit better to go to g6, and now came rook e6, a fine move using the fact that the pawn on f7 is pinned. Black responded by playing g6, and white now chose a beautiful combination, rook d6, winning a pawn. If now black captures, then rook f7 check, king e8, queen e1 check, king d8, followed by the simple trade on c6. Why that trade is so important is that now the knight no longer guards the e7 square, and there's not much black can do against the white queen getting there, which, for example, after pawn takes, is quite deadly as checkmate arrives. Well, a very fine game by the British Grandmaster John Nunn that demonstrates that it's enough to do logical, simple, common sense moves to win a game of chess. Just look out for the mistakes the opponent makes and take advantage of them. Well, I hope you enjoyed this game, and be back next week for some more chess ideas. Bye-bye.